So I'm going to talk a little bit about some longitudinal work that we're doing at the moment. It's a bit of a work in progress, so I'm hoping to have a bit of a dialogue and to get a sense from people what you make of these findings, which are in some sense, I might say, quite provocative and surprising. So a bit of a framework for this. I'm kind of thinking of autism as a dimensional condition. Yeah. So I remember when I came into the field I got my first job as a research assistant for Professor David Scoos at UCL. There was still quite a widespread belief in this field that autism was a categorical condition. It was kind of qualitatively distinct from typical development and from other conditions. It's a good example that would be Down syndrome. That's a categorical condition. You have Down syndrome or you don't. We're not all on a kind of Down syndrome continuum. A consensus, I would say, has been building, driven in particular by John Constantino's work and work that we've done in ALSPAC and work coming out of those big sort of epidemiological studies in Scandinavia, that actually we can conceptualize autism not as a qualitatively different state from, if you like, normal range social variability, but rather as representing the extreme of a trait distribution that extends right through the general population, that we're all on somewhere. Which kind of makes this idea that we have people who are kind of high on this trait distribution, we conventionally label them as having autism, and then if you happen to be just their semi-arbitrary threshold, you would conventionally be labelled as, or not labelled as having autism, but you would nevertheless have very high levels of autistic traits. Now what's becoming clear in the last decade or so is that where you are on this trait distribution matters. It is influential on other aspects of your development. So for example, we know that autistic traits in childhood, so having sub-threshold but elevated levels of autistic traits in childhood, are a risk factor for developing conduct problems, which we know can obviously be very detrimental to child development and also to people around that individual. Anxiety, depression, hyperactivity and attention, peer problems, these are all associated with having elevated levels of autistic traits. So another thing I want to emphasize about this is that there is no kind of magic threshold above which these autistic traits start to count. So it's not like you can have some autistic traits and then a few more autistic traits and they don't really influence your risk, and then suddenly you go over this kind of cut point and then they become a risk factor in developmental psychopathology. The burden of risk is spread right across this trait distribution. So in a sense, your risk of developing conduct problems is higher if you're there on the distribution than if you're there. Yeah? And it's certainly higher if you're there or there. So it's a continuous effect, appears to be what we're finding from these data. So in a way, I think that this interesting sorts of form of human variability, our capacities for social communication and flexibility, is a sort of neglected dimension in developmental psychopathology. We're all interested in variability in attachment security, variability in irritability, emotion regulation, all these sorts of dimensions that we place people on, forms of human variability that we measure and then think, okay, so what's this person going to be like when they're 20, or what are the risks that they might experience crossing into adolescence? I think we need to be more aware that this is a form of human variability that's really important in helping us understand the development of diverse different outcomes. And yet, we know very little about the developmental course of autistic traits in the general population. Partly thanks to work done here, we know we're learning a lot about the developmental course of autistic traits amongst autistic people, especially autistic children, infants and children. But we know much, much less about the development of these autistic traits amongst people who have so-called normal range variability. Characteristics. We don't know about levels of change and continuity over time, and in particular there's not much is known about, or very little indeed is known about, for example, change in continuity as people move from childhood to adolescence. And then given my own focused interest or specialist interest in gender differences or sex gender differences in the autism spectrum, I'm also very interested in whether by looking longitudinally, by thinking in adding a new dimension, if you like, to our way of thinking about gender differences, sex gender differences, whether we might discover things about differences between males and females in terms of their autistic traits. Yeah? So we were particularly interested to find out, are there sex-gender differences in autism trait trajectories? And we had two kind of theories about, or two predictions about what we might find. Yeah? And what's probably a nice thing is that they're opposing. They make different kind of predictions about what the data will do. So the first is the compensation hypothesis. Meng Xuan was talking very eloquently about camouflaging this idea that females with autism may be particularly adept at developing skills and, if you like, diminishing their overt social difficulties over time. So that would predict that females with high autistic traits will learn over time to compensate for their social communication difficulties more effectively than do males with autistic traits. But there is another kind of show in town here. There's another possibility, and it was first put forward by none other than the man himself, Hans Asperger, in 1943. And apparently, he was sort of in their clinic that they had in Vienna, I believe it was, wondering why they never saw any girls. And this was one hunch he came up with. It could be that autistic traits in the female become evident only after puberty. We just do not know. I don't know, I can't resist asking whether people have got any, would like to guess which they think, which of these two would win. I mean, I noticed lots of people nodding along. I imagine there's a lot of knowledge about autism and gender differences in the room. Has anybody got any thoughts on that, or perhaps you're reluctant to kind of put a bet down?
Well, I'm a child psychiatrist,
yeah.
So I tend to see the verbal kids who are diagnosed after age 5, 6 in Hamilton.
Yeah.
And it is interesting that I've got more girls who are picked up in the teen years, and it is interesting that there's a lot of gender. I think to some extent it's a bit of the developmental task of adolescence shifts, and it's such a strong period of social neuroscience, social neurocognitive change, and for some of these girls just sort of shift in the same way.
So it sounds like you might be going with Hans Asperger.
I feel like the adolescent concept.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Well, let's all be revealed. Well, I don't know. I mean, given that this work isn't published yet, I can't quite say if that's certainly, but I will offer you some sort of indication of which of those is most likely to win out. So the data we used are from the Avon longitudinal study of it's not patents, it's parents of children, known as ALSPAC, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. So this was a cohort of young people who were recruited in a town in southwest England called Bristol, in the Avon region. Bristol seems to have a connection, I'm not quite sure why, with hot air balloons. It's very hard on Google Image to find a picture of Bristol without hot air balloons in it. And the hot air balloon has become the kind of symbol of ALSPAC. And this is a wonderful birth cohort study. So these were people recruited who were born in 1990, 91 in this sort of area of southwest England, and the retention's been pretty good. They've been followed up very regularly over the years, and all sorts of interesting things have been learned from ALSPAC. It's a real sort of precious resource, and I would, it is open. You have to pay a bit for the data, but it's open to everyone. I would recommend people to think about ALSPAC when you're if you have questions to ask that could be addressed by it. So we measured social communication difficulties at 4 time points in this sample, and we used a measure called the Social Communication Disorders Checklist, which was developed by David Skews, and then I helped out a bit with it in the later stages. And this is a parent report measure, 12 items, so it's kind of, as we say, quick and dirty, if you like. But you have to do that in something like ALSPAC, because to get yourself into the questionnaire, you have to have quite compressed sort of measures. And what it addresses is what I put here, the ability to communicate and interact effectively with other people based on a capacity to mentalize. That's the kind of construct it's attempting to get at. So you would have noticed it doesn't measure autistic inflexibility, that, if you like, that other half of the dyad. So that's an important sort of, to caution for what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about the sort of social communication aspects of autism here, and not this very interesting topic of what are trajectories of the rigidity, inflexibility stuff, which is, in my opinion, sort of understudied in the field. Okay, is this measure any good? It fulfills several sort of standard sort of psychometric standards. It's pretty reliable, the internal consistency is good, test reliability over quite a long time period is pretty good. In terms of validity, there's some evidence for its criteria validity with respect to autism. So it correlates sort of moderate to strong with more in-depth, sort of detailed parent report measures of autistic traits. Again, criteria validity, it has good sensitivity and specificity with respect to an ASD diagnosis in Ausbach and also in clinical samples. And also, there's work coming out that variability on the SCDC, as we call it, the Social Communication Disorders Checklist, is influenced by overlapping genetic influences that impact on your risk of developing the clinical syndrome of autism. Yeah, so there are, if you like, shared genetic influences on normal range variability as measured by the SCDC and on your risk of having autism. Yeah, so again, that's kind of helping, I hope, to build the case that this is measuring human social variability that is relevant to autism. And we also know that this is an instrument that shows high heritability, and that high heritability is demonstrated not just in childhood, but also in adolescence. Okay. So we analyse these data, age 7, 10, 13 and 16 years. John Heron, who's not as scary as he looks in that picture. He's actually a very lovely man, but he looks like and Liz Pellicano, who is as nice as she looks in that picture. Two colleagues who were particularly sort of core to this project. So 9,744 participants, fairly evenly divided by males and females. And John was our statistical expert. And he has modelled these data using latent growth curve analysis. And I'm also going to report a very preliminary growth mixture model, which is kind of a work in progress that's being done by one of my students. But I think it's worth just sort of throwing out there to you guys to get a sense of what you think and to express a little bit more about what these data are showing. Okay, but in terms of the latent growth curve models, this is what we found. Yeah? So this top line is males. So here you've got 7, 10, 13, and 16. The dots represent if you like, the actual means, the mean scores of these measures, whereas these lines describe the trajectories that we sort of modelled. So you can see they're fairly sort of in accordance with the actual means, and model fit statistics are pretty convincing. So the males have this sort of shallow U-shaped trajectory. Yeah. So if you model their means, you get this kind of dip going down from 7 to 10, and then this kind of shallow uptick, but essentially to me that's a picture fundamentally of kind of stability in levels of these traits. The females, we see something quite different. So again we have this intriguing drop from 7 to 10, but then we see on average this sort of escalation of these social communication difficulties as measured by the Social Communication Disorders Checklist, so that, and this is almost heretical in the sort of autism world, you see actually a parity of average levels in the general population of these traits at 16. So again, supportive of the kind of the Asperger sort of model, rather than this idea that maybe we would see a kind of a steeper decline in levels of autistic traits in females compared to males. And that's just modelling the disappearance of that gender gap. You see it sort of coming down and being eliminated by kind of mid-adolescence, mid-to-late adolescence. And if we kind of, that's been looking at kind of averages, sort of central tendencies. If we sort of get a more intuitive feel for the data, we say, okay, at each age group, who's scoring above and below the kind of established cut point on this measure? Who's in that range where you would think, okay, they've kind of screened positive, we need to have a look in and find out a bit more about this young person and see whether or not they have autism. So at 7 years, males are in line with conventional wisdom and what we would expect. Males are more likely to score above the clinical threshold on the SCDC. You see the odds ratio there. And if we take an even more stringent clinical threshold, if we take, because the standard threshold on the SCDC is about 90th centile. If we take a really stringent cut point at the 99th centile, you see a really strong male sort of, I suppose, disadvantage, you might say, overrepresented amongst those with extreme high autism trait scorers. And by the age of 16, in line with the models I showed you before, that difference has disappeared. So you have equal, if you like, proportions of males and females scoring above the cut point. If you think what this is saying, in a sense, is there's a group of kids who did not score up on the SCDC at 7 or 10. They did not score above the clinical threshold, but they did start to score up above it in adolescence. So we might call that a kind of adolescent onset group. And what we find is that females are more likely than males to be in that group. So they're more likely to not have been identified as having social communication difficulties as kids, but in adolescent years by their parents have been identified as having social communication difficulties. Now, again, I sort of feel a little bit like I'm sort of about to give a quick lecture on Sanskrit or something, as somebody who doesn't speak Sanskrit. In that this work was done by a student of mine, but I just thought it was a sort of way of beginning to explore the data a bit more and get a sense of it. So this is a growth mixture modelling, so attempts to identify within the participants groups based on them having shared trajectories on the SCDC over time. And this is a four-group solution, and what you see is, perhaps unsurprisingly, you've got this, most people, 8,351, are in this sort of purple group here, this low group. Most of these kids, they don't have high levels of social communication difficulties, and that persists across childhood and adolescence. Another sort of not particularly surprising group is this one here, who sort of essentially, although there is this kind of N-shaped curve, essentially they're people who were high scorers at the beginning of the period and they continue to be high scorers. Then you have this declining group here, the greens, who are, we've called them improving, 31% male. And here you have, corresponding to that group that I identified in a more sort of intuitive way by just looking at cut points in the SCDC, you have this, what you might call a kind of escalating group, escalating social communication difficulties. And they're 56% female, so they're in a sense a higher proportion of females than you would expect in a group defined by having social communication difficulties. So just to wrap that up, social communication difficulties appear for some young people to escalate as they enter adolescence. Females are more likely than males to experience a rise in social communication difficulties during adolescence, and in a way this is one of those findings that to me perhaps asks even more questions than it answers. Are we looking at genuinely autistic social communication difficulties in adolescence or something else? That needs to be investigated. Are we looking at genuinely new difficulties? Are we witnessing if you like, the appearance of social communication difficulties that weren't there before? Or, and I think you kind of alluded to this, and this is my kind of sort of pet. This is the theory that I would be I'm most convinced about at this stage, that needs to be tested, is do we have a situation where you have girls who had kind of subtle social communication difficulties that, in a sense, were not impairing, were not maladaptive in the kind of primary school environment, but as we find a social world for females that escalates in terms of complexity and demands, and then begins to outstrip relatively subtle social difficulties, are we witnessing, if you like, prior social difficulties becoming overt in adolescence? And that would certainly fit with my clinical experience, and it fits with this study Barjela et al. Was something where we interviewed autistic women who'd been diagnosed later in life, so from the age of 15, but mostly in their 20s. And a lot of them, when they told their stories, would talk about the experience of having difficulties, but these going unnoticed in primary school. And then as adolescence came on and the increasing complexities of relationships grew and grew, then people began to notice that they were struggling socially. As I implied, there's work to be done thinking about, I've been talking about social communication difficulties, and I've been kind of trying to nudge you towards believing that these are autistic traits, this is human variability that is of relevance to autism, but that needs, more work needs to be done to establish that. But this could have implications for late diagnosis of autism in females. We know that females get picked up later than do males on average. This could help us to understand that phenomenon. And I think, we're in the home of chronogeneity. So it's an important idea in autism, and I think we can expand, or we can apply the concept, I think, not just thinking about variability and outcomes of people who have a diagnosis of autism, but also, I'd say more generally, to the trajectories of people in the general population. What predicts increases or decreases in the social communication traits, and what outcomes are associated with different patterns of autism trait trajectory. That would be a very interesting thing to look in. And I'm particularly interested, for example, for this escalating autistic trait group, A, to measure autistic traits self-reported in adulthood, which they're doing in Ausbat at the moment, but B, to look at things like mental health, service use, eating disorder risk, so on and so on, those sorts of things that we know are actually associated with being an undiagnosed female with social communication difficulties. So I think I'll leave it there, and throw it over to some general discussion.